tous. Bonjour.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. It is always great to meet the audience of X that grows more numerous one year after the other. I'm Sophie Vess. I'm in charge of transport with the newspaper Le Monde. We're here to talk about the new challenges of mobility. As you know, this sector has a peculiarity. It represents 30% of the carbon emissions, and it's the only sector where we cannot get the emissions to drop, even though we have been trying for a while. So we have an hour with the best experts to find a solution that Hippolyte Dalbis will summarize at the end. So let's get started. To talk about the topic, we will be with the Minister of Transport, Mr. Clément Beaune, with Anne-Marie Drac, who was also Minister of Transport, but also of Foreign Trade, and President of the RATP, the subway company in Paris. And I think, Anne-Marie, you're also a board member with Air France KLM, and Total Energy as well. So we will also be with Yann Leriche. Yann Leriche is the General Director of Getlink. You may not know Getlink, but if I give you the old name, Eurotunnel, you understand immediately what we're talking about. And then Thierry Dires, who's the CEO of Covea, you know the MAF, the GMF, MMA, they're all insurance companies. He is the first car insurer in France today, so he knows exactly what's going on in cars and roads, etc. So to start the conversation, I will give the floor to Hippolyte Dalbis, who's a member of the Cercle des Économistes, who prepared this roundtable. And I would like to take this opportunity to tell you that he wrote an excellent book that he coordinated with Françoise Benamou, who's president of the Circle, the Economist Talk to the Populist. Hippolyte, it's a great book. Hippolyte, you have the floor. Thank you, Sophie. I'm just here to give you a few elements of what we're going to be talking about. I will start by saying that mobility is what we do every day. That's according to the Statistics Institute in France. They do 200 million daily commutes per day. That means that everybody does 3 journeys every day as part of their commute. So if we're going to do policies on mobility, we should allocate every day. We're going to impact every day the behavior of people. Mobility is a source of tensions, sometimes source of frustrations because of traffic, but heavy traffic. But we have experienced it when we were deprived of this mobility. We perceived it as a very strong deprivation of freedom. So the catchword, going to work every day in the subway and going back home is part of our everyday life. So Sophie said it. We often know that it's a sector that is responsible for a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, that is also responsible for impacting the environment. I think we should take the situation the other way around. Instead of seeing some problems, we should see it as opportunities to decarbonate and reduce the human footprint on the environment. What is very interesting with the mobility sector is the 3 fields of human intervention for decarbonation are here. The first one is the law and the standard. We can pass some laws to reduce mobilities, for example, forbid plane travel on short distances when there's an option to use train, etc. So it's not always easy, but it's one of the possibilities. The other option is to have some economic incentives with prices. For example, some have bad press. We heard about that. We remember the carbon tax that stopped in 2018. The TIPP, floating TIPP, it's a French measure. Or we can also play with prices, having lower prices typically to encourage people to use transport that are less polluting. And the third option, these are not necessarily competing against each other. The third option is the technology change, the innovation, and this is also an option, but that requires a lot of energy and a lot of financing. Last point, since it's everyday's life of people, it's not just a matter of experts or engineers. It's a political issue. We remember the Yellow Vests, which was the revolt in France of those who have a car and drive a car. Last year we saw exactly a similar situation, except that it was a protest of those who don't have a car. And we could see the reaction to law enforcement agency was to stop all the circulation of public transports. So the fact that it's political does not mean that it's complicated, but it means that it's fascinating. So I'm looking forward to have the 4 members of the panel today to discuss this with us in X. Thank you, Hippolyte. Clément Beaune, you have the floor first. I hadn't made the link between the yellow vests, those who have a car, and those who don't own a car. Maybe you can say something about this. You can answer this comment, and then we can try to identify our roadmap to decarbonate the sector. Thank you very much. Of course, what Hippolyte said sums up very well the situation. I've been discovering this for a year now. When you're Minister of Transport, you have the drama you have the privilege of dealing with the drama of everyday life situation, and you have to you are in charge of a public policy that affects people at least once a day, sometimes twice a day, depending on people's commute. In all crises, there's a subject of mobility of transport because it is integrated in our everyday life. This having said, all the people in the country are waiting for policy to transform mobility and transport. And the first change is going to be decarbonation. You gave a key number when you talk about decarbonation, collective decarbonation, to be neutral, carbon neutral in 2050. The carbon emissions represent 30% of transport today. And it could be 30% of the problem or 30% of the solution. From a public policy point of view, and I believe we'll get back to this, we can't really debate it for too long because the applications are simple. We need to activate all the possible levers at the same time. When you have a sector that represents 30% of the emissions, 30% of the energy bill, that touches everything, impacts everyone, and the only one that hasn't dropped its emissions since 1990, you have to activate all possible levers at once. That doesn't mean that you have to press all the notes at the same time, hoping that the music will come out well. You have to be consistent between all the buttons that you're going to press at the same time. So there's some what we call brown uses to green uses. We need to decarbonate modes of transport that are the most. We're not going to go from road to rail, but rail to plane. We're going to decarbonate all the modes of transport in themselves. It is not inconsistent to support electric car massively and at the same time to encourage people to take the train. We have to fight on both fronts, because if you have a lot of travels that are being done by road, if you don't decarbonate the rail, you don't do the full job of decarbonation. So when I say we don't need to press on all the buttons at the same time, I'm going to give you a precise example. I see Augustin Romanet, who's another representative of the airway sector. So if we want to decarbonate the sector and be relevant on such and such measure, but it means that sometimes we're going to tax, sometimes we will move from one mode of transport to another. That was the famous decree of 2 hours 30 that entailed closing a number of air routes. But I also fought so we can have public means of subsidies for R&D to decarbonate this industry that is capital for the country. We're not going to suppress the plane. We're going to decarbonate the airplane before we suppress it. So that means that we need to encourage our industry. We have a sovereign industry, particularly in the aeronautic sector. So we have to invest in sustainable fuel, in engines that are less polluting, in all the decarbonation strategies. So we need to talk about the modal report. We need to change all sectors with innovation in industry. The only challenge that remains is in these levers of action, where do we insist on frugality? My deep conviction is we're not going to tell people is that decarbonation means less mobility, because it's a human need to move. We haven't waited for so long to feel the need to move around. It's an essential need, but we have to look at usage, some frugality measures, incentives, etc. We can't say that some sectors are different than others. There's some sectors we want to reduce the footprint of the activity. In terms of mobility, we don't want to do this. We don't want to tell people you are going to move less, and every time we're going to find solutions. And if people feel that we're just blocking them, the whole debate on the carbon tax showed it, we have a big problem. So we should not give up on those tools. We just need to help them be better. Among the various public policies that we have, I believe that we have a few cultural changes to do. We talked about it a lot with Anne-Marie Hydrac. We have a French policy that is very focused on infrastructure. And of course, we need quality infrastructures. That's what we do by having some charging stations throughout the highway grid. But if we don't think about the usage, and if we don't think about the intermodality, we'll miss out on a number of fronts. Let me take the example of the car. We need to have electrical cars. But on the very short term, before we have a full fleet of cars that is electrified and public system, add additional public transport, which takes a long time, we will need to think about carpooling. It's not instead of, or it's a fundamental measure that needs to be implemented. It's the same with intermodality. So sometimes you feel that you want to be completely carbonated, you take the car to do everything. But if you want to decarbonate, you take the train. But if you decarbonate only 10 kilometers out of 50, it's already a good step. It's already a good effort. Or if you take your own car to go to a place where you have an access to urban transport that works well, it's already a good start. So I think it applies to the state, to the local authorities. We need to think more instead of usage and intermodality. Anne-Marie Hydrac, what Clément Beaune is saying is difficult not to agree with it, but it's difficult to do it. So can you explain to us what are the blocking points between the needs and the duties of the citizens? You are already president of France Logistics, so there's a whole discussion and a whole thought on mobility of people and goods that matter in the equation. I will start with building on what said the Minister of Mobilities. The big challenge is to combine our duty to decarbonate, so the 30%, 1/3 of goods and 2/3 of people, with the right to mobility. The right to mobility is part of the law that your predecessor passed, who is now a prime minister. It has to do with equality, freedom. It has to do with society. So very often when we talk about new mobilities, we forget that not everyone can work from home. And not everyone has the luxury to live in a big urban area where they have big offers for mobility, from scooters to subway, etc. Regarding goods, it's not really a right, but it's a need, rather. A need to feed people, a need to supply stores. So also construction, public works, waste management, then agriculture as well, the food industry, the food sector, and various goods linked to distribution, imported or not. And among those on the distribution side, there's the e-commerce that, whether it's B2B or B2C in France, represent about 14%. And I'm not talking about ton per kilometers, but I'm talking about values in terms of profit, turnover. So we can see that goods cannot move around by themselves. They need to be transported. We talked about it with the Prime Minister and Clément, and it's true that more circular economy and more industries located on our territory could lead to more logistics movement. I would like to add a lever. You both talked about many things. There's a lever, an organizational lever, and a lever to be more focused. Let me take an example. For the people who use the Metropolitan Express that are going to be put in place, I feel, and Mr. President of the SNCF, if you want to transport at the same time 300 people, subway, train, it work. If we want to transport dozens of them, this is more a matter of buses, coaches, express bus, which are implemented by some local authorities. If we want to transport 3 people, we are looking more at carpooling situation, and there's a number of companies, I'm thinking about Ecomove, they propose carpooling integrated in the public offer of public transportation. At some points, some periods where it would be better to move smaller number of people at a time. So the logistics works for 200 kilos at 10 kilometers. Trains, it's great, in 100 tons. Trucks, and over hundreds of kilometers. And they don't drive right into the restaurant or next to the restaurant or next to the hospital. Trucks are measured in tons and for all distances. So I think that we need to target this way. For logistics, I would like to offer 3 different types of levers. The first one is the massification. I talked about in terms of vehicles, but it could also be grouping some orders, for example, wondering if you want to have everything on time is always relevant, organizing the shipment more smartly over time. So it's my first M, massification / mutualization. The second lever, you know how important it is at the moment, is the question of meshing. You're going to be surprised by the word meshing. I'm talking about the meshing of infrastructures, all the works that are being conducted by SNCF Réseau. But also, I would like to talk about the meshing of stations, which is storage. It's not great for the carbon footprint when a person who lives in the southwest of France has something delivered from Spain, for example. The trend right now to move away the storage space further and further away from the urban centers is not very smart either. So when we think about how we're going to organize things, the second M for meshing, is very important. We're looking at different levers. We're looking at urban planning at the local, regional stage level. And the third M, which is motors, engines, you've already talked about it. And I would like to say that regarding trucks of various sizes, we are at the very beginning of the story. Right now, we build less than 1,000 electrical trucks per year, all sizes. The registration for year represents 50,000. So it's a start. With the minister and his colleague, we worked a lot on the roadmap, the national strategy, low carbon strategy. Apparently, everybody tells us that we need to start. Today, we're still at 90% diesel. So it's going to be a long way to go. And I would like to tease you and tease some of my friends here I think what matters is the journey, because no matter what we do, we will all get mobilized for modal transfer. We will remain at 70–80% road transport for goods, and for people, maybe when the Greater Paris will be implemented, when we'll have a lot of offers and call for tenders, will still be at 2/3 of cars. So everything that you're doing and that the government is doing to promote decarbonation of vehicles, it's going in the right way. And the global vision of all these challenges that are going to take a lot of time. It's the same thing then for the sustainable air fuel. It's going to take a long time and a lot of money. And it's good to have a shared hope, and we do have it. Thank you, Anne-Marie Drac. Jan Loriche, maybe you can tell us in a few words what Getlink does beyond going under the channel. You have a whole logistics activity business, and this year you decided to present your results in an interesting way by presenting not only the financial results, but your decarbonated margin, by integrating the price of fuel as if we were paying it the full price. So you kept the price determined by American fintech, which is a very high price, and you still have a positive result. But if all companies did it the same, they would surely look differently, and it could be probably a trigger to decarbonate quicker the transport sector. Yes, Getlink is the group Eurotunnel that I don't present. We also have some freight trains in France and the Netherlands and Belgium, and a lot of transport between France and Great Britain. I would like to take a step back on these questions of decarbonation and mobility to understand what are the challenges, and to remind that we've been trying to decarbonate for many years and we don't succeed. We've been fighting for 40 years from the urban massification. We've been trying to organize a massive modal transport towards public transport, and we haven't succeeded either. We have been trying to reduce CO2 emissions emitted by cars for 40 years. If each car emits less today than it did before, the CO2 emissions still are increasing because we drive more. And we've been trying to organize carpooling for a while. After the war, when everybody wanted to have their car, we're at 2 to 3 person per car. We're only at 1.5. So it's a lot of years where we are less and less people per car. So we measure well why the question is very difficult to answer. The mobility sector is the only one sector that hasn't been decarbonated since 1990. And since then, we have taken some very strong commitments with the Paris Agreement. We should take it a step further and to do it successfully. Why didn't we succeed? I think that's the question that we need to ask ourselves today. And the main reason is because mobility is more than transport. Mobility is transport, but it's also a question of where you live and where you work. It's a question of where you go to relax, where you shop. And if I feel that it's going to take me too long to go to work, of course, I can go from walking to driving, but I decide to move and move closer, or to work from home, to get a different job, a job that is closer to where I live. So it encompasses a lot of different realities. We talk about transport, we talk about urban planning, housing, and all these policies in France belong to different authorities. We have a Minister of Transport today. Even if he's brilliant, he doesn't choose the speed that people drive in the urban areas. And that limits us because it prevents us from having a holistic vision and to treat mobility as a whole, the everyday mobility and the residential mobility. At this stage, we could be pessimistic and think that it's we can't do it. It's mission impossible. But such as Tom Cruise, who releases his next movie next week, I believe that there's a way, and we can do it if we manage to put in place 3 key conditions. The first one is to address this different layers of administration. We have to address mobility with prices, to give a rate per carbon that is the same everywhere in France and maybe in Europe for all the different modes of transport, for which will give visibility over time. So it's based on the logic of the polluter payer, but the not so good news is that we don't give visibility on the cost of carbon. Concretely, a household that decides to move further away from the center and to drive into the center of the city does it on the basis that its mobility is not going to, the cost of the mobility is not going to grow over time. If you give them mobility over a long period of time, maybe they'll choose to move outside of the city, but close to a train line or closer to the city. So that's the first topic. Give people some visibility on the cost of carbon. Second element, if we use this logic of polluter payer, the carbon is going to become, you're going to have to pay for carbon. We're a listed company. We are submitted to some regulations where we have to publish our financial statements. We have to publish a lot of extra financial indicators, particularly with all the new directives that are being issued. But we never make a link between financial and extra financial. In the way we rate carbon, it's the same situation. So we're the first one to publish our decarbonated margin. So we calculate our traditional margin for the financial expert in the room. We understand how it's done. And then we add to the traditional classical margin a bill that is for now only virtual that corresponds to what we should be paying if carbon was to be paid for. So we calculate our ton of CO2 emitted on the 3 scopes. We multiply it by a price per ton. We chose 97 euros, and we see the results. So when we do this calculation, if we realize that our margin, our positive margin, brings us down to a negative decarbonated margin, that would mean that our business is not sustainable over time, and that we have a real issue or a real business model, or we have to make a deep transformation of our operation modes or infrastructures to manage to go beyond this decarbonation stage. With Getlink, our activities are mostly green, and our decarbonated margin is only 3% less than the classical margin. So we're a very well-positioned actor.
Alors c'est celui qui a vu.
The third point is the one that Clement Bone mentioned earlier, which I think is important to repeat, is the one about infrastructure. Local authorities have an important role to play there. To have clean transport, you have to have the appropriate infrastructure, whether it's cycle tracks or a rail network that allows this in transport businesses for goods and for passengers. We are not, in 4% of cases, we're not able to satisfy the contracts we've signed with customers because of network problems. So to transport goods on a train from point A to point B, in 4 times out of 100, we're not on time because we have a network problem which requires massive investment, and we know we're lagging behind in that area. So those are 3 points. So a price signal, carbon tariffication that is more visible. This is missing. We have to go to make sure we have the right indicators, and we have to have a green infrastructure. So 3 points. Thank you, Thierry Gardez. Thierry Gardez. You work with cyclists, amongst other things. How do you evaluate our use of cars, which represents 80% of mobility and journeys? How do you see this use in the future of the car? I don't pretend I have a crystal ball and know what's going to happen. It might be very disappointing for everybody and deceptive, especially for my friends on the panel. As you've been kind enough to introduce myself as a major car insurer, let me give you some information about quantities and explain why, in my opinion, they are important in relation to the question we're talking about today. Today represents 3/4 of journeys that are carried out using cars. The average French car is a diesel, 11 years old, and only one person uses it. That's the photograph of the average car user. In the future, it might be useful to look at the younger people. Their behavior is slightly different. If you look at the population of a very urban area, let's say the Paris urban area, or if we compare that with rural areas. In the Paris urban area, less than 41% of young people aged between 18 and 26 have a driving license. It's 85% of the same age group, 18 to 26, in rural areas. So that's one indicator about the frequency of use of cars. And the trends in the difference is increasing. 7 or 8 years ago, the difference was not as great. It was 7 points less between urban areas and rural areas. One of the questions is about the trajectory, to use a rather simplified term, that we've experienced over the last few years, which doesn't really illustrate in rural areas in particular a real reduction in use of cars. The other indicator about use of cars is that sales of new cars represent less than 3 times the sales of used vehicles. Less than 3 times. If we look at all of the transactions for cars, including businesses and fleets. But if we focus on private individuals, the differences is from 1 to 7. For one car that is subject of a commercial transaction that is new, there are 7 that are the subject to a commercial transaction and which are used cars. So 7 times as many. So this shows how contrasted the landscape is. The minister said earlier that we needed to use all of the different levers. Of course, that's true. But I think, first of all, we have to know them and observe them so we don't offer solutions which are too deceptive for our citizens. Let's be careful about generalizing too much. Let's be careful to not be too impersonal. This can mean that we're not meeting the needs of people who need to use a car. And finally, there's one word that hasn't been used about cars, is freedom. Cars are very successful because they are a wonderful tool allowing free people to have freedom. I'm not saying we should be enchanted by this freedom or just only use cars and nothing else. What I'm saying is if we don't look at that dimension of the use of cars, we will not see a part of the problem and therefore a part of the solution. No doubt, a car is the machine, is the manufactured object that has the most structural impact on our existence through the travel we do and the way our society is organized. All of this has been determined by cars. It's less true now, but this historical aspect is something we've taken on board and we must ignore it, not ignore it when we're looking for solutions. Thank you very much. This is an interesting moment because this roundtable is taking place at a time where the government is carrying out a strategic planning to decarbonize with a lot of discussion, and apparently the Prime Minister is very demanding and often says to people, this is not correct, you haven't looked at all the different arguments and possibilities. Perhaps, Clement Beaune, you could tell us where you've got to in this strategic planning, and can you tell us whether you are looking at the freedom that cars give people. Perhaps we need lighter cars. Perhaps how far are you going in your ecological strategic planning to take account of all of these different constraints? And if you're looking at freedom, you have to accept certain constraints on freedom. I believe that Anne-Marie Hidrek, you're also participating in this work. Perhaps you could also explain how that is going. Thank you. I can confirm that it is a difficult and demanding piece of work. It's probably the first time we've done it in such a systematic way, sector by sector. Of course, I'm in charge of transport specifically, but I've participated in several meetings, and if you include in the mechanism so many different hypotheses, this means that you have to take a number of risks. For example, I'm looking at the transport sector. If you're saying we have to use a modal transfer and in the urban areas you want to develop active mobility solutions such as bicycles, if you want to reduce the number of daily journeys every day, this means that by 2030 people will work from home at a particular time with a particular frequency. In fact, we don't really know that's going to be the case. We know even that for transformations which, according to the figures, are quite small. If we take the example in the rail sector, if we want to double the proportion of rail, if we were to double the amount of rail for goods and for passengers, this would leave the road in the different types of use with other trucks and cars. Roads would still be very much in the majority. You get the impression when you double rail, it's a lot, but in fact it's not really very ambitious. We could still have a car that is still going to represent 80% of our use for travel in 2030 or 2040. It's still massive. That's why I'm saying that we have to look at the uses. If you only, in inverted commas, because this is still, even that is quite a considerable investment for the government and local authorities, if you invest in infrastructure, you don't have a very clear idea of how it's going to be used. We know, for example, that for public transport, their attractiveness is determined by the infrastructure, its availability and the proximity and accessibility, a whole series of criteria. You know that in international metropolises, and the issue of security is very important. If you're a woman, if the infrastructure, even if it's clean and bright, if it's not safe, people won't use it, especially if you're a woman alone. So we have to look at these cognitive aspects in our public discussion sometimes. Christophe Fenochet and other people have been in debates with me and talking about the prices of trains for people to buy tickets for trains. If we're perfectly honest, our effort in the area of public policy has to be in investment of rail. What I'm saying is that this planning process is done in a very systematic, rigorous way, and this is why we need to use as many levers as possible and in an organized way. The idea is to have something that is ordered and scientific and to have quantification and planning. But in the transport sector, to look at the most important sector because it has the most to do and it represents 30% of transport, we won't be able to do that. The decarbonization of air transport, road transport and modal transfer. The truth is that if we do as much as we can, we have a chance, as you said, if you're looking at the glass half empty or half full, we'll be able to do maximum decarbonization of the transport sector. We don't know where that will be in 2030. We just know what we have to do, the different phases we have to get through by 2030. We know that if we want to achieve stay on our trajectory that has been planned at the European level, so by 2050 we'll have carbon neutrality. It's about 35 million tons of CO2 that has to be economized in the transport sector. That has never been done, nothing like it. So how do you actually work? What is your working method? Do you work with the different players? These are administrations working just amongst themselves. Let me take an example. In the climate resilience law, which was voted before I took on the responsibilities as Minister of Transport, there were roadmaps that were people called Article 301. In Article 301, you have a decarbonization roadmap for each sector. Maybe people here have participated in this. It's true for goods and for passenger transport, and it's true for each sector, air, road, rail, etc. So we asked each of the economic players, using the approach that my two neighbours have mentioned. We asked them what they thought would be the technology available and the cost of use and the cost trajectory for decarbonisation of transport use in the future. Let me take the example of goods. Good transport. And here the hypotheses are changing very quickly. Before COVID, looking at working from home, we didn't think it was going to be such a massive type of behaviour by 2030. Is it going to continue up to 2030 or not? We don't know. For goods transport by rail, good transport by road, we thought the cleanest technology would be natural gas. Today, we know, although there are only small production units, probably we're more capable than we thought 3 or 4 or 5 years ago to use electrification instead of natural gas. So it's in the really at the teething stages. So we're very much at the beginning of what we're doing. But we know that even for a 44-ton truck, we're able to produce it in an electric version. This was unthinkable 3 years ago. We were talking about air transport earlier. The sustainable air fuels. We brought together a lot of players in the sector before the Paris Air Show with the President of the Republic. You can remember 5 years ago, nobody was talking about sustainable air fuel. There's a kind of imaginary solution. Today we have a roadmap for the transport sector where all of the actors are saying it's going to represent 40 to 50% of the decarbonisation target between now and 2050. This justifies the rules. We have, it's necessary to decarbonise at a European level. We didn't imagine this was going to be a priority 4 or 5 years ago. What I'm saying is that we have to do this planning work, but it will change and be modified as time goes by. And we know we're able to quantify the steps we have to take, but we know if we want to walk up those stairs step by step, we're going to have to put a lot of money in different sectors at the same time with visibility and another point about visibility. I'm not an economist. I agree with what Jan Riescher said. There's one point where we have to be very humble and modest, which is the visibility in terms of the investment trajectories and public subsidy trajectories in terms of the carbon price for a reasonable economic price. I think intuitively it's not going to be more than 10 years. And if we want to really give an industrial and economic trajectory, you have to look up to at least 2050. So how credible is it to give an economic symbol? You have to have this balance between defining the signals and admit there has to be some fragility. For sustainable air fuel, this has been defined. There will be a market price that has been defined. This will seem vital for the initial investment in that solution. I don't think anybody here is capable of saying whether we will have the same price in 10 years or 5 years' time, depending on the environmental or other types of developments, and whether it might be a different technology. Will sustainable air fuel suddenly become much, much cheaper? We don't know. That's why it's so difficult. We're living in a world of uncertainties that we have to deal with. It's not saying we're powerless. What I'm saying is we have to be aware of all of these many multifaceted aspects and of all these different tools and levers we can use. Anne-Marie Edouard, this planning method, do you think it brings together the companies and civil society effectively? And the NGOs? I'd like to talk about my experience of what we call the National Low Carbon Strategic Planning for road transport. I can tell you about that. For goods and for passengers, I felt that it was a very good method indeed, an excellent method, because they had the energy experts, the energy producers who say they can produce organic or not, organic fuels or not. Then we had electricity. They said it'll be enough for everybody. And then they said, oh, it depends if we use hydrogen, we need more green hydrogen, etc. That was the energy people. Then we have the manufacturers, the builders, with one subject which is important there, which is to say that it's not always a by Chinese act. So they have to be included as well. And so then we have the users with all of the difficulties in ingesting. We don't really know how much electricity is going to cost. We don't know how it will be taxed one day or another. And we don't know how there'll be an allocation of different types of fuels that people will want to use, particularly in the organic fuels. So we have to be very modest, and I think politically, I think it must be very difficult for the minister, but he's succeeding for the time being. It's difficult to accept a good balance between this trying out and trial and error, because it's not true that we will have translated everything to rail and to electric cars and to cargo bicycles between now and 2030. That's not going to happen. At the same time, we have to build up the hope and the momentum and the capacity for investment of the different players. There will be public money invested and a lot of private money as well. So it's an excellent method, I think. The political methodology concerning the deadlines, because often it's a question of deadlines. When will this happen? That's what people want to know. This is very complicated, and that's why the actual idea of planning, I think, is an excellent idea. It's not just 22 pieces of work run by different civil servants. It also means everybody has the capacity to define their investment capacities and their decisions to invest in the different spaces. We're talking about urban planning and the locations of warehouses and the role of local authorities, and over a period of time also, and also these aspects of planning, which is important in all of our activities, which is the question of competencies and human skills, because most of the transport occupations are under pressure, because a lot of them will be completely transformed. Of course, this is the case in the car industry, with the, of course, electric vehicles are not the same as a combustion engine, of course. This won't be the same sort of job. And in other professions as well, there are more and more service professions and more sophisticated professions involving artificial intelligence, forecasting traffic, and using software to secure customer loyalty. So in planning, we have to take account that aspect as well, which we are doing with the Minister and the Prime Minister. Yann Le Riche, concerning your approach to decarbonisation, have you been followed? Have people been inspired by you? Have you had reactions to what you've done? Could be a useful planning tool, do you think? Very recently, we've communicated for this time with the decarbonised margin. We will be doing this again. We had an expected amount of feedback. We had a huge number of demands which we weren't expecting. We're not able to respond to all of them. We're not here. We're here to resolve our own strategic issues, but the aim is not to evangelize. And on these subjects, we can see we're right at the beginning. There are a lot of other profound questions where we need to make progress, including from a theoretical point of view. For example, we talk a lot about investment. When there's money, people are expecting a return on their investment. And the government also is raising questions about its profitability. It's not really the same sort of investment as a normal financial investment, but the question has to be asked. Today, I think we no longer know what is the cost of capital in a decarbonizing world. All of the financial theories, according to which we work today with the different portfolios, I'm sorry to use the jargon, we are working in the MEDAF, the model for evaluation of financial models. This model is designed for a world where there is money invested in several companies and several financial assets, and we raise a question of whether this capital is correctly allocated to get the best possible ROI. We have a source of money going to several types of investment. The world has changed now. Today, we no longer have one source of money, we have several sources of money. To simplify, I would say we have two. We're on one pouch of money which will be invested in green activities, another amount of money which doesn't care less and just looks at the yield and efficiency, and could invest in green or brown activities. So the model we use for evaluation of these financial investments no longer works. And so we're no longer able to assess these things properly. And so apart from the fact we don't have a visibility about the cost of carbon, we don't know how much this is going to cost. This is a difficult question, but in other areas there are central banks who are able to look at an objective of 2% inflation of carbon price. If you have that, that's better than nothing. And on the other hand, if we look at the purely financial part of return on investment, we have to change our software, otherwise we're not going to arbitrate correctly. What we were saying that it's going to be difficult because it will be very costly. We've already seen that with the yellow jackets. that it hasn't been easy. If we also don't do it properly, because we're not measuring and calculating properly, it's going to cost even more money than it would have cost otherwise. So otherwise we won't do it at all, or there will be complete rejection by our societies, and so our societies will be completely paralyzed. President Macron, in his program, promised that there would be electric vehicles available to households for 100 euros per month. We can see it's rather complicated to implement this scheme. There is a transport and environment think tank. There's an NGO and a think tank, and Transport and Environment and Lidri, who are proposing a solution, saying that you could have car manufacturers making a small light car with few options, which would be much cheaper than the vehicles being sold today. And in general, the question is being raised of having lighter vehicles generally. I'd like to know, as an insurer, Thierry Dierez, do you think tomorrow's vehicles will be lighter, less robust, more dangerous? What do you think? Here again, I can't really see it. I'm sorry in front of such a distinguished audience to appear so weak in terms of my vision, but it's true. The subject for insurance is not first and foremost the vehicle. The subject, most important subject for insurers are the accidents linked to the vehicles. So, to answer, I don't know whether it answers your question, if vehicles are smaller, lighter, less robust, etc., we can fear there will be more injuries to users. When we have to think about that aspect. However, we can consider a prospect where the damage to the cars themselves will be less. The cars won't be so expensive and the repair costs will be lower. I don't have a precise answer on that subject. What I can say is that, unlike what you might think intuitively, electric vehicles have an average repair cost that is higher than combustion engine vehicles. Particularly, this is not what people think, no. But in fact, insurance makes it possible to call into question what people think. Or what the manufacturers say as well. No. That's what Tesla says. I haven't said anything about the manufacturers. I'll say something afterwards about that. Why are electric vehicles more expensive to repair? In the event of a fire, for example, in a combustion engine vehicle, normally most of the parts, I'm not talking about a complete fire of a whole vehicle, but a fire, you can recover some parts. In an electric vehicle, you won't get any of the parts. None of the parts will survive. So I'm sorry to look at these rather concrete aspects, but you don't have the same situation for these two different types of vehicle. I can't give you an exact answer, but for electric vehicles, the studies that have been carried out don't show a reduction in the cost of repairs. Thank you very much. We're coming to the end of our round table now. I'm trying to see, I don't think we have any time left for questions. We have 2 minutes. Perhaps one question? No, not even one question. No questions at all. Perhaps the speakers will be able to remain available after the session. There were a lot of questions online about autonomous vehicles and future RER systems in the metropolis here locally. We could have carried on for further. I'll let you finish. Hippolyte, have we found the solution? Yes. Well, the solution in 1 minute is not easy. It's a kind of form of pragmatism. We have to use all of the different levers. We have to also mobilize organizational dimensions and financial dimensions and insurance dimensions. Did you want to ask a question? We can't answer any questions, and we don't have time. Thank you for being attentive. It's quite impressive. Thank you.
Bonjour à toutes, bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session dedicated to circular economy. I am part of the member of the Economist, and I'm professor of economy in Marseille. I am Alain Tranoy, sorry. I just have a few minutes to present the session. If I had to say in one sentence what people do who are in charge of commissions, I think they find some formulas that look like the Middle-Age chemistry to transform lead into gold. That was the goal of alchemists. And today it is to transform old stuff, waste, and give them a new value, a new life. So the alchemist was already, his hope was already to do some circular economy at the time. So do we make any progress in terms of circular economy in the world and in France and in the world? As the African proverbs say, the tree that falls makes more noise than the forest that grows. So are the entrepreneurs of circular economy, are they making that much progress? According to the numbers, the figures of the Environment Agency, this progression is fairly mild and is happening with a growth rate that is still fairly low. I'll just give you an example. When you measure the part of products that are manufactured a particular year, what is the part of material that come from a former production cycle? This agency, this European Agency for the Environment, gives you the number of 11.6% for Europe, which means that 10% more or less of products that use some materials that have been used before in previous manufacturing processes. So it's fairly low. So we could see the road that we still have to, that is still ahead of us. As I said, the production pace is such that in the previous decade we went from 10 to 11%. So the progression is very mild at the European level. And that's the reason why in France, with the recovery plan, we had 370 million euros that were allocated to projects of development for circular economy. And the goals are very ambitious at the European level. It is to double this share. I give you the number of 11.6%. We have to go to 23%. That is the goal. So is France performing well in this circular economy landscape? Yes. The answer is yes. The French performance is good in terms of circular economy, with this percentage of products that were used in the previous cycle and that's being reused in the existing cycles, because France is the number for France is between 20 to 25%. So we're doing better than the European average. So we are good students on that front. But on other issues, we're performing less well, particularly on waste. A fourth of the waste is still being moved to dumps, to public dumps, whether in Europe it's only 16%. I would like to finish with 4 topics that I find very important. The first one, I gave you the European outlook, what's going on in developing countries and in emerging countries. Emerging countries represent 40% of the world GNP. Second question is the shock of the inflation that we know on raw material. Is it boosting the circular economy or not? That's the second question. And then there's the question of financial resources. When an entrepreneur goes up to a bank to find some ways to financing, is he welcome? And the fourth question is the question on public authorities. Are public authorities doing enough to generate a virtuous circle of circular economy? And could the fiscal instruments such as bonuses could not promote more circular economy. So I'm going to give the floor now to Gaël Flétou, who will be moderating this roundtable. Gaël, you have the floor. Hello, Alain. I'm delighted to be with you. We have a very good panel of speakers to answer those challenges. And to begin, we have Gwenola Chambon, who's the co-founder and managing partner of Vauban Infrastructure Partners. We have also Cyril Garcia with us. You are responsible for CSR and board member of Capgemini. We also have Lucy Bash, who's the founder of Too Good To Go. And finally, Inde Ben Miloud, you are the president of the Algerian think tank. So in terms of circular economy, we need to have a number of paradigms, particularly on the offer side. So I would like to start with you, Gwenola Chambon, so you can tell us how the challenges of circular economy have fundamentally changed the infrastructures and how the criteria for selections are not the same as before. At the infrastructure level, as you said, the challenge is that today we consume much more material than we can bring back to the economy. We're talking about 7% versus 9% a few years ago, which means that it even gets worse, and we are not going in the right direction. Why? Because humankind lives beyond this mean, and we can't afford to live anymore on a planet that doesn't give us the resource that we need. In terms of infrastructure, we're at 1/3 of consumption of material worldwide, material to construct or to disconstruct. We are a big producer of greenhouse gas. We're at 79%. So we're a big polluter. So to see things in a positive way, it leaves us a lot of hope and a lot of opportunities, because we have a collective responsibility to make things better. If we look at under the regulation aspect, historically, in 2009, it was a niche topic. Regulation would address recycling, circular economy, only on the theme of waste. Everything that is being thrown in the bin, what do we have to do about it? Stop putting them in dumpsters. But it was very niche. In 2015, we started thinking about a larger vision, which is the whole production cycle. And then finally there's taxonomy, and the topic becomes even wider, and we look into the production chain in its whole. So we can look at an economy such as a donut-shaped economy. So we start with the conception phase. We're going to ask people to build buildings with a real design approach, where afterwards the materials can be recycled. For the last 40 years, we never wondered about the future. We had energy that was a very wide supply of energy and a cheap supply of energy. So now there's a real general wake-up call. And what does the crisis do? It basically shakes us up and asks us to have a common reaction, a common mobilization. So we're leading a research with Vauban, with Altermine, that unites 40 company managers that are getting together, and they're trying to identify the factors that are going to make things move. So in terms of innovation, we have a lot of projects on eco-design. We can see it on the road. We have some testimonies from Vinci, from Sacyr, which created some asphalts that incorporate techniques made on used tires, from used tires that make them more sustainable. So we're moving into different uses, a holistic approach with using less material, that longer. Because we have to break the concept of, we'll build something that is going to become obsolete very quickly. So build stuff that is going to last longer, and decide from the get-go how it is going to be recycled. And we don't really see it in numbers, but this trend is clearly accelerating. Thank you. It's a good example to start on infrastructure. If we think more widely, We can move on to you, Cyril Garcia. You are part of the board of Capgemini, which is the company that helps companies to go through their digital transformation. So what can be done to completely change the offer of products and services to build a circular economy? What types of value should we give to this economy so they have a return on investment that meets their expectations? Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Jean-Hervé Lorenzi. If we don't do anything, we're going to crash. So I hope we're all mobilized. And we have some economists, some young economists at Capgemini who have started to describe the notion of inside circular product. And I think that's an interesting framework to define the circulation, the movement of goods and services, and also to talk about the notion of sovereignty. So if I answer you as an industrial, I think there are two topics that are leading the circularity. It's the industrial platforms, sector by sector. And there's a question of regional platforms, the regional clusters that are very important to all the conversations here in Aix. So on the first point, it's about value development. We see it on the aeronautics sector. We recycle some spare parts for airplanes. So that's a challenge for biodiversity and emissions. And from the beginning of the traceability, by the use of data, by recycling and selling back the parts, because it's a matter of valorization. We're not just looking at recycling, but at reusing the pieces, the parts. And we can see that some markets are emerging. So it's a value creation. It starts very timidly, but it will accelerate. We see a number of worldwide players that are starting to invest on that. And then there's a question, the regional aspect, which is very important. We see some regions that will specialize. The north of France, for example, will specialize on the gigafactories for batteries. It's not about creating new plants. It's about tracing the components, and there's a European regulation on the passport of the battery, and the goal is to impose circularity on those components. We can also anticipate, we're not very far from Marseille, but on the question of retrofit for the aeronautics industry and the naval industry. We will have to integrate hydrogen in some hulls, boat hulls, so we'll have to recreate some different ways of welding. And so I think it's a combination of those two dimensions, the sectorial movement, because we don't have any choice, and the regional movement that will be financed. You saw the huge move in the U.S., billions to build some clusters, region by region. It feels like we're being in a socialist kind of plan. I see some people smiling in the room, but I firmly believe in those two aspects. And we talk a lot about the climate tax, but this is the hope to create an economy that is going to be net zero at a very soon horizon. The climate tax, hydrogen, gigafactory, carbon capture will be circular or will not be. So we have no choice in the matter. And finally, to try to answer Alain's question, there are two accelerators. The first one is technology is here, the technical platforms, onboarding data. We can guarantee their replicability. And I believe that bankers and donors have an interest to get into this circularity battle. They should be more intrusive in operational models of their clients. First, because regulation, as Gwenola said, regulation is coming, so we will not be able to do whatever we want and finance whatever we want. So I'm very optimistic on this virtuous circle. And here, I guess it is the turn to the next speaker. We're going to change sector, so we're going to move on to the food sector with you, Lucy Bash. You are the founder of Too Good To Go. It is an app that I believe a lot of you know now. It's anti-waste, food waste. And I would like you to tell us how you managed to grow a model so that it could be efficient. Today you operate in 17 countries. In France, you have 15 million users. And what used to be a startup it has become in a few years a great model. Can you tell us how you can change, can you ramp up and scale up, and how you can convince the players of the food and retail sectors? Hello, everyone. I faced the problem of waste very early on, and I worked in production plants, and I was told about the food chain, and some people even showed me the food chain on a linear manner. And a linear change when resources are scarce is not possible. So that's why I started looking into food waste, and I realized that over all the food that is being produced, we throw away 40%. It's quite crazy to imagine that the number is so high, and why don't we talk about it? Why don't we hear about it more? So the beauty of circular economy is you could build a model that allow you to consider the ecosystem as a whole, and to come up with some models that are virtuous for the whole of the ecosystem. And that's where the idea of Too Good To Go came from. How do you create models that are good models for the whole chain? Because you are going to transform what you're used to consider as waste into resources. And in terms of value creation, you can break it down between all the actors of the change. For Too Good To Go, we consider that the product is necessarily thrown out at the end of the day. How do we make it available to people who are shopping nearby? So how do you connect the right people at the right place so they can act together and transform a waste into a resource and to generate some value in the societal and economical sense of the word? So once we've identified this win-win model, and I can assure you that you just have to think about it often to find new models, just because we accepted to have bad habits, but if you start having good habits, it's very easy to put in place. With Too Good To Go, we felt a very strong attractivity, and that's where we grew very fast, because when the retailer was used to throw away these products, and he discovers that there's new flow of clients that are going to buy his products, and so he gets some additional money. And when a consumer pays a third of what he would have paid 10 minutes before, and we have an economic model that is perfectly aligned with our environmental goals, because our goal is to measure the number of meals that we saved. So it's a common interest to see this business grow. So we started the business 7 years ago. Today we save 3 meals per 7 seconds. We have 15 million of consumers in France. We could hire 1,200 team members that are actually fed with a number of meals that we save, and we saved so many meals from being thrown away. When we wonder how we can take it a step further and how we remain relevant, because the model of Too Good To Go today is well known now, and there's a real thinking on how we can scale up this model. Our only competitor today is the bin, because the more Too Good To Go's will be in the world, the better it will be for the humanity. How do we remain relevant? We go back to the two fundamentals. How do we consider the whole ecosystem, and how do we hang on to our mission, which is to reduce food waste? So we worked a lot with the local retailers and the big players. We also work with the industrial companies, because we realize that food waste happens at all stages of the food chain. So our vision is still naive. We just want a planet where every food created is being consumed. So we want to provide solutions to the consumer, to the distribution, but also to the industrials. So we launched in a number of countries a solution so industrial companies can send directly to consumers products that would be not that would be close to their expiry dates, that have maybe a small flaw in the packaging. All these products have a value, and us as consumers, we're very proud and economically positive to fight against food waste. And it is the whole challenge for me today for the companies who are playing in circular economy is to align our environmental, economical, and social goals and to capitalize on these three pillars to change things around and to start thinking circular instead of linear, which has led to a world where we wonder today how we're going to keep having the necessary resources to feed ourselves and feed the rest of the world and all the other economies, not to have to end up with frugality. So this question is very important. And you can see the applause that you get in the room. What's happening in Algeria, in Ben Miloud, you're chairwoman of CARE, which is the circle of action and thinking for companies. It's a think tank, and you look at improving economic and social conditions in Algeria. What role is circular economy playing in your country, or can it play in a context of globalization? We talked about it when we had our first chat. Thank you, Gaël, to give me the opportunity to tell me what Algeria is doing in that field. The adventure of green economy started very early in Algeria, over 30 years ago. The awareness came in 1992 when we signed the Convention of Biodiversity. But as you know, the events of the Black Decade have kind of stopped the momentum. And it's only at the end of the years 2000 that the state has started to rethink the environmental strategy with a number of texts of law, particularly on waste. And we are not a country with a major industrialization because we bring a lot in from Europe and elsewhere. 2 billion plastic and 1 billion cardboard. So then all the stuff needs to be recycled, which is not easy because in waste recycling, we're really only looking at a 12% result. So there's a market of 300 million euros with this market, and circular economy. We started talking about it really, as everywhere else in the world, I believe. It's a theme that is still very novel. In the year 2016, when we signed the Paris Agreement, and 2018, Algeria organizes the meetings of circular economy, and that's when we really start thinking about it. So the state has put in place a series of texts. A number of them have not been updated. We have still a major challenge in terms of toxic waste. The awareness came with the private sector because many companies and many groups are starting to rethink how they produce by imagining to have some recycling units. So our group, the group Ben Amour, which has the recycling for the construction sector, the beverages producers, they agreed on how to better recycle their plastic and glass, for example. All these initiatives are underway, and they're taking more and more importance, and people are starting to realize that we need to have sustainable development, that we need a green economy, that we have to invest in the future. So how do we see CARE, a company, which is a think tank, not only for environment, but for everything that impacts the development of companies and in Algeria? The idea is that there's a big market. Young startups should look into it and participate in it, participate in this recycling effort. So, during the COVID time, we learned to do a lot of things. We didn't receive anything anymore. There were no more imports, so we had to make do. A lot of people start recycling. A lot of small companies were created to recover the appliances and fix them and resell them. And so they have a second life. Now we have a culture of secondhand in Algeria, which was not something that could be imagined a few years ago. So more and more we feel there's an effort from the population, but it's not enough yet. And we don't have the necessary population to sort the waste, and that remains the big issue. The cities and towns do the work and they try to get the population involved, but the whole mentality has to change. But we don't really have a choice today. We really have to get involved ourselves as well. So the model to follow, very honestly, I think that we need to all take part in it. In Algeria, we pollute just a little bit the world. It's more the big industries that you need to talk to, and it's up to them to come up with solutions that are interesting as well for emerging countries such as ours. There are some products today that the future with artificial intelligence may help us, emerging countries, to shorten the cycles to produce. And we hope to capitalize on the experience of European countries or other countries that have a real policy for this circular economy. Thank you very much.
You were telling me about consumers, this paradigm. It's unthinkable without changes in behaviors and uses. How can we respond to this challenge to involve the consumers and understand their expectations? Cyril Garcia, you're right that the cultural obstacle is important. As Hinda said, how do we change from these 70 years of people being conditioned to act in a particular way? I spend, therefore I am. I buy, therefore I am. That kind of attitude. This is the subject we need to talk about. The question of the supply chain, which becomes a supply circle. These are technological issues and financing issues. The big subject is the cultural issue. So for companies and marketing and communication departments, how do we change over? The good news is, as you can see in your company, when you do consumer research, there's now a strong awareness. The majority of people are aware of the issues to do with food, clothing and packaging. That's the good news. People are aware of the importance of having more determined action to change the way that they consume goods. But they also highlight blockages, the lack of transparency. Am I certain that this label is actually valid? This is something I'm sure you've come across. They also come across problems to do with cost. I'm not saying it's only the job of people who are in charge of marketing to do that. I think that in companies we are part of this change, and we need to promote this cultural change in the use of PCs and servers that have been recycled. This has an impact. We have 360 employees around the world. Today, we've got above 20,000 PCs that have been recycled. That's still to be achieved. So how do we put greater pressure on the suppliers and the big suppliers in this world to achieve this level of recycling? And also, to participate in the struggle, how do we get the government to put the pressure on public procurement? That's important in France. This is a struggle that we're beginning, where previously customer satisfaction was everything. It can also be the case even now. The most important thing was customer satisfaction at any price, and we've been burning the planet because of that. So how do we change that cultural attitude? That's the important issue. I can answer to that. We very quickly looked at this from a societal level. If we want to have a planet without any waste, how do we create societal marketing? I was saying earlier, we have 80 million consumers who use our app. It's one of the most downloaded apps in the world. So it's not you're going to be able to use conventional marketing to have these 80 million users. We could have had a huge marketing budget. We still wouldn't have been able to achieve that. What we did was we said, how do we involve all of our ecosystem in the reduction of food waste? The ecosystem today for food is a situation where you have the consumers and the companies working in the food industry. You have the people placing public procurement orders, and you have the children, the future consumers. How do we make sure that starting from school, people start to talk about food and understand the impact of food on health, on the environment, and on well-being, and on biodiversity, etc. So with Too Good To Go, we asked ourselves the question, how can we have a concrete impact? And so we decided to talk more about preventing food waste. So this made we had more people becoming interested in this subject and finding solutions, therefore becoming consumers with Too Good To Go. Let me take a few examples. Today, the consumption dates represent 20% of food waste in Europe. The consumption dates means best before date, or there are two types of date: best before date or must be consumed before. 50% of consumers didn't even know there were two types of date on the products. And they didn't realize they meant completely different things. One thing means best before. It's a question of the quality of the product. You can still consume the product after that date. Up to 3 dates, it still can be sold. Except that people don't differentiate between that and a product that has to be consumed before a certain date. The distributor removes the product before the best before date before the ultimate date of use has arrived. So we have to get everybody around the table to co-build with the distributors and the food production companies and the consumers to have concrete commitments so that everybody is aware of the issues in this area, to enable people to improve their purchasing power, because they won't throw away so much product, and they'll be able to reduce greenhouse gases as well. This is something we've been working on for 2 years. We were recognized as the privileged interlocutor on the subject of best before date. So we built up a date on consumption dates with the Ministry of Agriculture and Consumption. And you can't imagine the number of press articles we were able to have on the Good to Go Pact, who is reducing food waste thanks to this work on the best before dates. There were reports on TV and on a number of other events which made it possible to improve the credibility of our approach and also to promote our cause. So journalism still has a role to play then. That's good. And the important thing was people wanted to know, what is your press agency? For the 7 years of our existence, we didn't have a press agency. And we were told, well, if you don't have a press agency, 9 months later, nobody's going to contact you. In fact, we are still contacted by a lot of journalists who want to talk about this application. We've also created a program in schools called My Anti-Waste School. I talked earlier about the importance of raising awareness in children about food waste. So we want to create a food waste awareness kit to be made available to teachers so that they can talk about this in the classroom and in the canteen about how to reduce food waste. And here again, we saw an amazing number of schools who downloaded this app. 10% of schools downloaded this program. So the teachers are very now pleased to be able to talk about this subject in their schools. For me, this is marketing. It makes a concrete contribution to our societies so that our company takes on its full responsibility to advance our cause in a benevolent and way. That's the advantage of this, is that this is beneficial, and after 7 years our company has a turnover of 100 million euros and is continuing to grow right around the world. What do you do when consumers are using an infrastructure? The challenge for us is a very good report on this, is the GAPS seniority report, which gives the figures on the world level. If we think about this historically, what has happened, in 18th century, the rate of urban development in the world was 10%. In the middle of the 20th century, it was 30%. And in 2007, according to the UN, we became an urban world. For the first time, urban development represented more than 50% of the population. Today, we realize that in less than 30 years' time, 2.5 billion more people will be in urban areas. This is a big challenge because the consumption patterns are going to change. We're not all at the same levels of development. Some countries are having huge population growth where the cities are becoming very large in a small period of time. We have to manage that, and the infrastructures are necessary to house people, to give them an infrastructure which will enable all these people to live in good conditions in cities. For us, the challenge is to manage adaptations according to the needs of populations. So if we're talking about cities that are creative, we have to support them with innovations to give us the means to create infrastructures that will be recycled. On the other hand, our developing countries are the big consumers of materials, and who have to make a big change in the uses. And then we have to talk about the city. How do we adapt the city to the uses which are changing? The infrastructures created 20 years ago are no longer suitable. We have digitalization, which completely changed the uses. We have car parks in the city centers, which are no longer of any use, which have to be redesigned. We have to reorganize green spaces in the cities and increase green areas, because when you have torrential rain falling on our cities, we can see that the water evacuation systems are no longer appropriate. So we have to redesign cities. This isn't something you can do alone. We have to do this hand in hand between private and public sector. The public sector can provide regulations and incentives and subsidies, and means of having some traceability so that consumers can understand that you have a degree of incorporation of waste into a building or even a product. And this transparency is necessary. You have to have incentives. You have to push industry upwards. And this is done through territorial planning and hand in hand between public and private sector. There are big challenges in Europe. We believe that 150 billion euros of investment are needed. And this is a big gap that has to be funded every year to be able to achieve a sustainable economy. And in Algeria, how do you deal with this? Our problem in Algeria is awareness raising. All of this is only started very recently, but increasingly the state is starting to take action, especially concerning the startups. The young people have created startups, many startups, to create a real circular economy with more and more organic products, and more young startups have been created. Young girls have started getting involved in new types of agriculture and recycling of different parts of fruits. For example, recycling of olive stones. Of course, there's a lot of olive oil produced in Algeria. And the state has put in place a support program to give incentives and benefits to people involved in this kind of recycling activity. Is this enough? Well, it's an everyday struggle. I'd like to react to what the lady said about food waste and expiry dates. In terms of food, whether in Algeria or elsewhere, we don't do enough work to explain that a particular product can be consumed after its best before date up to its expiry date. And then you have the idea of medication. Studies have shown that the duration of life of a drug, for example, can be several years, and even 10 years afterwards the drug can still be used. Don't you think also that there's a lot of work to do in that area as well, with lots of other people, with the health authorities? Yes, that would be a good idea, yes. From my point of view, there should be international cooperation. Algeria alone cannot do it. What it will be able to do with civil society and a lot of private companies is to raise awareness amongst the population. That's the most important piece of work we have to all do, And I think, as we have said, there's tax incentives as well. I have to say that if there is a green production product, incentives should be available. We already have schemes to help people create companies with the tax breaks. Perhaps it might be interesting also to develop this green project further. With more tax incentives and tax breaks, I think it's a lot of work to do. It's not finished. You talked earlier about artificial intelligence. I was wondering what role artificial intelligence can play in your occupations when you're talking about the circular economy. Are there possible solutions that are being developed? Yes, I think so, yes. I'm not a great fan of AI. I just think it's a tool that can help save time. And for us, the emerging countries, we need that. We are lagging behind, and so in my opinion, if it can help us do concrete work in this area, I think a lot of people in Algeria are aware that something needs to be done. From my point of view, this could make a big impact to help us catch up because we've been lagging behind. From Lucie Vacher from Too Good To Go. Well, what I'd like to say, before we talk about AI, we need to talk about intelligence by itself. Today, we are in a system where we are in routines which are totally unacceptable and absurd. When I say 40% of the food we produce is wasted, we are an intelligent people. How is this possible? For me, in a food chain, we have to understand what we are eating every day. Today, the consumer and the producers are much too far away from each other. We have been saying they're becoming more and more urban. I grew up in Paris. First seed I saw grow when I was 25 years old. I started crying. I said, wow, nature is wonderful. When there's sea and water, everything grows. I was 25 years old when I realized that. So I think, of course, technology can play an important role, and AI as well, but it shouldn't be decorrelated from ecology and learning about the basics, about how we live every day, and to understand seasonality, to understand the importance of nutrition. A tomato that is grown very, very quickly because of artificial inputs is nothing like a tomato that is grown in the summer, that is grown near where we are, which is much better and will bring us nutritional qualities. We were talking about this morning. There are countries that are able to feed themselves at last, and the nutritional quality between the time when they weren't feeding themselves and they are feeding themselves, the nutritional quality hasn't changed at all. And the rate of obesity has been multiplied by 10. So it's a real question. It's not a question of giving access to food for everybody. What kind of food are we talking about? How do we get people to realize what they're putting in their bodies every day? I think it's very important for people to have that sign of intelligence every day. Concerning artificial intelligence, it's a great facilitator to model a lot of things. In Singapore, for example, we created a twin concept for updating the city in virtual reality in order to test lots of things virtually, to try to improve the functioning of the city and test a number of ideas using a model. In Vauban, we carried out a study with our friends from Havas about artificial intelligence and how this can have an impact on our infrastructures, because we can't deny this is going to happen. We need to anticipate and think about it and see how we can use it appropriately. And it was really interesting, because they designed the future in rather an extraordinary way. The most positive thing is that everything you can learn about in management and anticipation. For example, in someone's everyday life, there might be a way of knowing that what kind of products are in the fridge, what is the expiry dates of the products, to give me an alert, to tell me it's going to be very hot soon, and therefore I need to have enough water, and also to make sure that I have to be careful about my consumption, and I shouldn't overconsume. In her area, Lucy is absolutely right. In the world of industry, the revolution of AI is exactly that. It won't succeed if you don't use data, artificial intelligence, etc., to just simulate. We're working on projects for industrial furnaces that consume as much as the city of Aix-en-Provence. We need to better understand the production cycles and the heating cycles. With this technology, we have lots of use cases in these areas. Of course, it's a very good question. So yes, we won't succeed without AI and digital genomes. I wanted to react and respond to what you were saying. The way we think in Algeria is we're not an industrialized country like you, so we don't have the same reactions. For me today, people of my generation are in a hurry. They want to catch up with the other countries. We still use organic agriculture, although we're starting to have more and more greenhouses, but it's not everywhere, not at all. We still have good quality vegetables and good meat products as well. Our food production industry hasn't been industrialized the same way as in your countries. Our reactions aren't the same, and the way we think about food is not the same either. When you talk about being intelligent and saying, yes, the way of eating is important, that has to be adapted to each country. For me today, what I say is it could be a great help in a circular economy. I'm not a technical specialist. I'm more interested in the information technology for the legal field. But I can tell you that for us as emerging countries, we can't lag behind. We have to catch we can't miss the boat. I'd like to add something. I agree that food is something that has to be local by definition. I think in the case of the emerging countries, the idea isn't so much to catch up, but to better than we are doing from the very beginning and not get our bad habits that we have started to adopt. We've adopted for many, many decades, and to not copy us in that area. We have some questions online, and then we'll see if there's some questions from the audience here today. Before we hand over to Alain for the conclusion, a change in behavior by the greatest number is necessary. Therefore, a financial impact is necessary. What is the tax incentive policy that we need? Somebody wants to know more about the solutions you've talked about in your different discussions. Just a few words before the tax incentives, a question of public policy. I don't know if the question was asked perhaps to the Minister earlier. This is absolutely central. We have thinking about the fiscal policy. Is that a political objective? Yes or no? We have to know that. This is the important thing about IRA, which is an inspiration for innovation in the US, with subsidies and tax breaks, which are distributed very liberally for innovation. And they're going to channel a lot of investment, which is going to go into the US, unfortunately, and so for us this makes Europe less attractive, and this is a great shame. Do you have any questions from the audience? I can see some hands being raised. We'll take two questions and then we have to conclude. Could you hand out the microphone, please? Yes, hello. What are the sectors in Europe that are really circular? What is the percentage in each sector, for example, in cars, in packaging, cardboard? I don't know. Can you give me some figures? Okay. You're all familiar with the car industry. The most advanced sectors here are at about 35 or 40%, and the heavy industry sectors are at 5 or 10%. And another important thing is the question of recovery. Recycling is one thing, then you have to recover and put things back into circulation and re-commercialize. That's the important thing. Today we're just at the beginning of this story. The paradox, when you look, for example, at what we did, we analyzed mobility and roads which consume a lot of carbon through transport. The interesting thing was that we realized that we could recycle asphalt when we do maintenance of the road surface. And so, in fact, we could recycle 100% of the asphalt, but then we have a problem, which is that when you get to 70%, that's the threshold to really be able to recycle 100%, you generate too much energy consumption, and it's absolutely devastating. So we have to find the optimum ideal amount to be able to recycle 100% without it having too much impact on the carbon footprint. That's why we are advocating the use of interior circular economy products to give the industries indicators so that you don't only measure the creation of wealth, you also measure the value of this circularity. If we'll have some answers in our conclusion, perhaps. Alain, did you want to conclude, Alain? We don't have much time left. Yes, I'd like to conclude by referring to the words of a speaker and the general theme about giving hope, renewing hope. Have the different speakers given us hope about the future place of the circular economy and the path towards a sustainable economy? I can see several hopeful messages. The first message is Gwenola, who said that we need to adapt a holistic approach right from the design stage, so the processes and products take into account the fact that they have to be recycled and have to live again once they've been used for the first time. And this immediately makes it possible to have a circular economy. What Lucy Back said also was that the developing countries, the emerging countries, should go more quickly and better than we can. How can they do that? They can do this by adopting this holistic approach right from the beginning, especially if I've understood correctly, the cultural struggle is in the process of being won in Algeria, for example. This is what Ind said. Talking about the increasing awareness. The second big idea is the one that was Cyril mentioned, saying that technology is there. We have the technology, and that means we just need the financial resources and the ideas. And Lucy Bash said, we just have to think a bit. Think of what exactly? This idea that we're throwing away food, we all know about that. I was wondering, what is the super original aspect of this approach, which has been very successful? Noted that all of you have applauded Lucy whenever she spoke. I think it's a fact that a business leader has started to adopt the strategy of an activist. Well, what have you done? You pinpointed a practice to do with the expiry dates and best before dates of products, which went against the circular economy. And you have used two means of leverage. First of all, you made the public authorities aware of this issue, which is the important thing as an activist. And secondly, who made the leverage? It's the press, the media. They were the second lever. And there's one great strength in our country, is that the media and journalists are completely on the side of the fight for the environment. So the cultural battle has already been won. And I think the final words should be for Cyril. He said, there's a cultural battle that has begun. It is starting to be won in people's minds. Now we have to win it in action. Thank you very much, Alain. Thank you, everybody, for listening to us. And if you would like to know anything else or ask more questions, you just have to grab hold of them. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bonsoir.
Hello everyone. You chose a very good panel. We're going to talk about CSR. You'll be able to ask your questions. I will ask you please to take your seats and to lower your voices so we can hear each other out. CSR, from mirage to reality. This is quite a big question, and it concerns the company's transformation. We need to change our productive model. The decade to come has challenges, holds a lot of challenges, and companies are at the heart of these transformations. The state will have to play its part, and the various regulators also, but it is a real responsibility for companies. CSR, social, environmental. Social takes more and more importance, and in social, I would say that S stands for sens, which is meaning in French, and that means a lot more to the young generation. There's an urgency, climate urgency, and it's a long-term urgency. How does a company deal with this urgency, this long-term urgency? That's what we're going to be talking about it for these next 50 minutes. I will present to you our speakers. First of all, Marie-Françoise Renard, who's the economist invited by the Circle of the Economists. She will moderate our discussion, and she will add a few scientific references on this topic. You are specializing in international trade, China and Asia. You told me that CSR is something, it's a concept that was not so foreign to the Chinese world. It is interesting to see that these questions are not only European questions. I can see among the first questions that came up on the chat box, there's a question on international trade, and we'll get back to this with you. I would like to introduce you the various panelists. Thierry Martel, who's general manager of Groupama Insurance. Groupama is a major player, 30,000 employees, 36 billion turnover, major player in the insurance, and an insurer is a company that has sensors on how the society evolves, and also how the risk scenario evolves. So we'll be very excited to hear you out. Arnaud Gangloff, you're CEO and senior partner of the Kia Group. It's a group specialized on transformation of companies, how today we put companies on the right path for a sustainable world, and we see that there's a need to help the companies that are at a loss with all the changes happening. So you have the outlook of an accelerator, of a guide, maybe. You operate on many sectors which are at the heart of this issue. Next to you, you have Radi Medeb. We are going to change continent. We're going to get closer to Africa and to Tunisia, and we're going to look at the Tunisian example. You have a wide experience in finance, engineering, industry, and you are also heading the Financial Center for Entrepreneurs, which is a microfinance institution, and you take this issue of transformation at heart in countries of the South where challenges are many, in a continent that will be also at the heart of this transformation. So we would like to expand our spectrum, our focal points, by watching with you how this dimension is being carried in a country that is close to us, that we think about often, that is fighting with a lot of difficulties. And next to you, there's Axel Lebert. We're very happy to meet her again. I wouldn't say that we lost sight of her, but we've seen you a lot for a while, and you were former Secretary of State for Digital Economy and Innovation. You were responsible for a large part for the French Tech, and you also support all these transformations, inclusion, digital, and how technologies are going to play a role in the debate that we'll be having. What role does technology play? Surely it can do everything, but we can't do without technology. So this is probably something that you will enlighten us on. You left the responsibility for the Red Cross, and now you're going to be in charge of CSR. We can't disclose where, but it shows your commitment. So I would now give the floor to Marie-Françoise Renard, who will give us the landscape for our session, and you will also have a chance to ask your questions in the room, or for those of you who follow us from distance on the chat box. We hope to take as many questions as possible. Each of you will have 4 or 5 minutes to talk about your topic, and then we'll have the roundtable going. Thank you, Vincent. The necessity of growth compatible with sustainable development is present every day, whether it's on environmental issues, social issues, ethical issues. All the actors of society have realized of the urgency of the change. And that's why we have implemented the concept of societal responsibility of the company that formalizes the central role of it in the process. CSR, as we know, is part of a voluntary approach of the company, so its implementation is not guaranteed. But despite the skepticism of some people, particularly on the environmental side, CSR has become a challenge a challenge of performance for companies. Is it a mirage or is it a reality is the question that we have to answer. Is it really a change of paradigm or is just hot air? So the values of society are changing, and that leads to the emergence of new standards. CSR and the methods to implement it and the choice to assess it remain very vague. Companies are referring to the SDGs, to defined or goals defined by many forms. The one that is the more recognized is the norm ISO 26000, but there's a doubt between the legitimacy of the approach and the cost of some measures. There's a big risk that CSR will remain a mirage. However, there's some big pressures that could allow us to scale it up. First of all, competition leads big companies to communicate more on their good practices and to worry about their reputation. Second, civil society, particularly with through the institutions, weigh on companies, on their environmental choices, but also for their human rights policy, with some concerns that are relative to the working conditions in countries that are supplying a number of goods. Third, a number of SMEs have to comply with the standards that are being imposed to them as supplier of big companies or as third-party suppliers. They can also be submitted to the pressure of the investors who don't want to risk to give money to companies that would be at risk in the middle term, particularly for their environmental risk. So they wouldn't lend money to companies that would not strongly mobilize on the CSR front. Fourth, within the companies themselves, there are some communities that have been created, communities of employees, but also some committees of managers to support the implementation of the principles of CSR within companies. Many areas of gray remain and block the implementation of CSR sometimes. First of all, the multiplication of references and labels make the information cost very high for companies. To this cost, we must add the cost of managing all this information. The management of the competition and prices has published recently a survey on eco-washing by saying a fourth of companies that were surveyed made some declarations that were wrong and contrary to the law. So there's a problem of information that is quite costly. Also, the assessments that are made are still very vague. Some companies are complaining to have some results that don't go with enough information, so they require some clarifications. And also, we must note that Europe is insufficiently present in these assessments that are still made by scoring agents, American scoring agencies. So despite an awareness and an evolution in the practices to be more efficient and maybe more realistic, the implementation of CSR should in the future be easier on an administrative point of view and be based on clear standards, maybe be more binding, which would imply that there's some good assessments being carried out and that these assessments could be standardized, could standardize a European definition. So the future of CSR is based on the capacity of mobilize the actors and mobilizing the companies on the various goals, CSR goals, whether they are environmental, societal, or ethical. Some capacities of adaptation of their organizations and capacities of cooperation. Because as long as we just stick to declarations, we are going to have very slow progress. I will stop here to give the floor to the other speakers. I'm going to give the floor now to Thierry Martel. And I would like to continue on what Marie-Françoise Renard told us. This is the first time that you're heading an insurance company where you manage the risks. There's a number of sensors that allow us to understand if we're still in the mirage phase or if it's becoming a reality. But based on what Marie-Françoise Renard said, there's some sectors that could act as facilitators, accelerators. Is the insurance sector that produces standards in its own way, incentives? Could it also encourage companies to go faster and to go further in their CSR approach and make sure that CSR becomes a part of their business model? Because it will be more advantageous for them to fully commit. Thank you for this question, and hello, everyone. The theme of this roundtable is CSR from mirage to reality. That means that the question is being raised and there's a gap between what we'd like to have and what we have. Insurers, we're in a particular situation because the carbon consumption from our activities is very low. It represents 10%. And those that we carry the responsibility for are the operations. We produce very little. It's the cars of our sales reps. So we absorb much more carbon than we produce. So the question here is not so much about what do we produce in terms of carbon, but how do we influence the production of carbon of others? And that raises a question in our investment policies and in our risk coverage, reconstruction techniques and prevention techniques, because the damage that consumes the less carbon is the damage that doesn't happen. So I would like to shed a light on the difference between will and reality. The first problem is the legitimacy. What legitimacy do we have as insurers to put forward our convictions on law in the name of a general interest that would be the guarantee? So what would we refuse to insure them because we don't like their choices? And to replace the insurance of hydrocarbon tanks because we don't like it, because we don't agree with it. We can, of course, disagree to insure a tank of hydrocarbon if it's next to a river, if they don't have a retention system. But I used to say that the problems of today are the consequence of the solutions that we brought to yesterday's problem. Yesterday we could eat well, and yes.
What legitimacy do we have today to solve these problems? Because if our cows are producing methane, is it up to us to arbitrate between the methane from the cows and the milk we give our children? This is a real question. The second spotlight I'd like to give concerns the costs, because if we rebuild clean, this is much more expensive than building back exactly the same. And here again, in a competitive business model, the insured people who are very attentive to their price will choose the insurance company. They will always choose the cheapest premium. How do we install a clean green model in a completely competitive market? The third subject is the subject of availability. Let me take the example of automobile repairs. So 12% of the parts we put on the cars are recycled parts. At 12%, we're up to the right level. We're not able to obtain more than 12% of recycled parts. It's not a question of what we want to do, it's a question of what is possible. The fourth point I'd like to mention is the business model. And here I come back to the area of prevention. Prevention is very good. It prevents us from producing carbon. It's more comfortable for people because it's better not to be ill or to have an accident than to have a medical treatment or have a repair of your house. Often the prevention costs more money than the loss. In terms of damages and personal insurance, there's no economic studying say that prevention costs less than the loss. It's often the opposite. It's not easy to understand. Even in terms of public health, prevention is more expensive than the actual loss. Secondly, prevention cannot be mutualized. The principle of insurance is we're all exposed to risks. We don't know who's going to have the accident. Everybody pays for everybody else. Prevention is not mutualized. Prevention is individualized. So we'll be trying to build a mutualized model based on this is very difficult. So the other thing about prevention, it is not very well accepted. It's not accepted very well because it's felt to be too restrictive, too intrusive. Let me take an example. This is a figure that is the life expectancy in good health in France. Yes, we live a long time in France. We live 84 years. We live in good health for 62 years. Not a very good life expectancy in good health. So you live for a long time in bad health in France because our public health prevention policies in France are not very well developed. These are things you need to bear in mind that we could come back to. One of the reasons why we're not making progress in prevention in the healthcare is that for personal responsibility institutes, we can find an agreement with the state. For the health, it's the social security imposes an accountancy-based approach where we can't find an agreement. Then there's the taxation. Insurance today is taxed very heavily. Concerning reuse, we pay VAT twice and we pay 10% if you do prevention in healthcare. It's taxed at 15%. We have a very punitive taxation on the question of prevention. So how do we get out of this situation? Maybe we'll see when we answer the questions. There are rules of good conduct in the different sectors to find solutions for prevention and accept a consulting role for insurance. I think the 20th century has been the century of efficiency. The 21st century has to be the century of efficacy. We can see from what you've said, Thierry Martel, that society will have a role to play because all of the dilemmas you've mentioned, they can only be solved if society changes itself in its aspirations and the way it manages its risks and what it puts as a priority. There's a big problem in the south. We talk a lot about decarbonization of the north. There's a big problem of decarbonization of the south. We all have to move forward at the same time. Axel Lemaire, it's up to you. Over to you now. We're noting another aspect of this subject. We talked a lot about innovation. You're interested in transformation. You have expertise in this area. You've worked at CNRCA. We're curious to see how you're going to combine innovation, technology, and effectiveness of CSR. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you today to talk about this subject, which is the building block for all of the others, in fact. In reality, in all of the roundtables, people are talking about the societal and environmental role of companies. When we ask if it's a mirage or reality, the answer is it's a utopia that we need to pursue, but it is a reality. And if I say that today, I wouldn't have said that a few years ago. This reality has changed very quickly. It's a reality in people's consciousness and in science and internally in business life. In people's consciousness because the pandemic has made us aware very quickly, very violently of the finite aspect of human existence, and that has played a role in the acceleration of accepting the principles of CSR. Also, thanks to science, our capacity to carry out modeling of climate change has become much more effective than before. The concept of planetary limits is a very recent concept. 15 years ago, that didn't exist. Today, we are able to develop models which apparently do not correspond to reality of climate change, which is taking place more quickly than the scientific models. But nevertheless, it is thanks to technology and to science that today we know we are really able to have a full awareness on an empirical basis of the full impact of climate change. And also rather a later realization by our decision makers in the political sphere and the economic sphere. I was a member of the government in 2015 during the COP21, and I can assure you that apart from the declarations of principle, there wasn't much commitment to action and transformation by the leaders of major companies. Today, this has changed, and it's changed very quickly, and now there's an increasing awareness amongst the younger generation. Thank you so much to the younger generations, how brave they are, who expose themselves and do something that nobody else is doing. Instead of them, they are representing the lobby for the future. We talk about the future generations, and they are doing that because I can tell you here again from observing them and working with them, nobody else can do it for them. So that's the societal reality, and a reality in business. We can see a whole panoply of tools that have been developed and that are used by dedicated CSR teams. When we talk about carbon balance, the materiality matrix, the analysis of the life cycle of products, and the analysis of the social life cycle, the different labels, the Scope 1 and Scope 3 impact assessments, and the circular economy analysis. All of these opportunities to transform. We're at a historic time because we're changing from a posture of risk prevention. CSR was a subject because of regulatory compliance. You had to meet the standards. It was a business challenge and a strategic challenge. We can see this in the positioning of the business leaders within the different companies, with very real success stories. For example, to take account of a method very specific to CSR and sustainable development objectives, which is the idea of stakeholders, the idea we can't take decisions alone, so we have to get everybody around the table in the sphere of influence of the company, including employees and suppliers and consumers, etc., to decide upon the CSR strategy. There are stumbling blocks. You've heard about greenwashing and social washing. Today, I prefer the impression of greenwashing when I see an advert saying buy a green car, when you know that SUV weighs 1.6 ton. I don't believe in the green car, and the GSCF is not a reality either. We see the increase in litigation, 82 items of litigation taken against multinational companies. The government that has been found guilty of inaction in the environmental field, and this leads to something which is called greenwashing. I don't know if you know that phrase. Today, enterprises are afraid to not tell the truth about their environmental action. Maybe they think it's better to say nothing and to be silent. This CSR opportunity is an opportunity to be true and tell the truth and to be sincere, to say that we are all on the same path of transformation. This is the aim of the Sustainable Development Objectives, to give objectives, to give goals. I'll end what I have to say by saying once we've got past these stumbling blocks, what else is missing? The CSR has to become a societal objective for sustainable development. That's not the case at the moment when we see that today, this week, we've had the four hottest days in the world. And the European Commission will duplicate by 2 the reduction in carbon emissions in Europe in order to achieve its objective by 2030. to reduce by 55%. We're not at all in a good position in that area. So what do we need to do? We need to have more social action, because in CSR, the social aspect is very important. We are more and more familiar with the social impact of climate change. In concrete terms, poor people are paying a price, even though they're not responsible. What I'm saying is not polemical, it's proven. And it's a fact. And also, the social aspect is important as well, because we know the investment necessary to support economic players in their transformation to more sustainable business model will certainly have a social cost as well. The Pesani-Ferry report highlighted that. It measured this cost. And so, yes, we're talking about public money and private investment as well. And so this is an important subject. We're talking about CSR that is scaling up to become part of a collective sustainable development. I've talked about the social aspect. I've talked about the need for investment in these subjects to support transition. I'd like to end quickly on data and technologies, because all of this can only become a reality with digital technology. Data to carry out mapping, data to measure the time, data that enables us to understand where we are. It is absolutely key. And we have to ask the right questions. What is this technology for? What is ChatGPT, for example? It could be very useful, but not all the time. You know, we have this latency between the time when you ask the question and the time when ChatGPT gives the answer. It takes up a lot of energy. Perhaps sometimes we could use an Excel spreadsheet or a search engine. The whole issue to do with use of technology to accelerate ecological transition will be a question of using the right technology at the right time for the right type of use. Okay, there we have a very detailed roadmap. Arnaud Mongloff, you are the CEO and senior partner of CARE, which is a consulting body helping companies transform themselves. We can say that CSR is a central part of business life, and in relation to competitiveness, when companies behave properly and when they have solutions for decarbonization and for environmental protection, this has an impact, and it gives them the possibility to win contracts. So there's an incremental effect, I would say. There's a real effect that means that now starting to become a reality for you in the areas you observe, where you help companies. Can you also see this process taking place? We are changing here from a mirage to reality that is concrete and transformative. We have a slight problem with the mic. You need to press a button. Well, yeah, for technology, all you need to sort out technology is just press the right button. Yes, you have to press the right button. Yes, I think there's an accelerating effect. I work for a consulting company, and what we do every day is to work on responsible transformation to help our customers. More than 20% of our missions are directly dedicated to contributing to responsible transformation. This percentage is increasing every year. So one of the leading French companies in this area, because as an influencer, we wanted to, in this societal and economic world, we wanted to play this role. I agree with the optimistic approach. There's a lot of things happening, a lot of activity, and for all of our customers that we work with, they've taken a lot of initiatives, a lot of effervescence, and I can see a lot of acceleration that we've just been hearing about. And we feel that. You can see that for ourselves. I think the important subject is scaling up. How do we move from all of these examples and wonderful stories? How do we move up to and increase the scale? I'd like to emphasize 2 points here. We have to have a collective vision of value. What do we mean by value? And if we have stay with the old version of value, we won't make progress. The other point is a relation with action. And when talking about transition, you have to have clear method. Axel put a document in the documentation for the rencontre to change from hope that is not disappointed. I think this idea of action is very important, and it inspired me. I'd like to come back to this idea of value. I think we all agree the extractive business models are in the past. We can't keep those. I think the trouble is that all of the vision of performance and economic and financial performance is focused on these extractive economic models. This is a paradigm that we have to be able to change. At IKEA, we're trying to get our customers to think of reduction and about reduction, reuse, recycling, about regeneration, to be able to reconnect to the living world. What I'm saying is there's a lot of innovation to find in this area of regeneration. And it's very important to change our business models if we want to scale up. The important thing is to have this capacity to realign the interests of the different stakeholders. I can talk in detail. For example, imagine you're a manufacturer of industrial washing machines. Your business is sell washing machines or to deliver clean laundry. If you're selling clean laundry, you no longer have to have programmed obsolescence because you want your machines to last as long as possible. You don't want to have use lots of water and lots of detergent to get the machines to run, because it'll integrate your margins and your costs. You'll be able to maximize your margins. So for the producer, that's good. For the customer, it's good because they're paying the fair price to satisfy their need, which is to have clean laundry. And the good news is that this is intelligent and useful for the environment as well and for the living world, because there's less programmed obsolescence, less manufactured products to make, and less detergent and less water. This is the kind of model we have to be capable of developing, and I think this vision of value centered on this alignment between the stakeholders based on a common interest is the key. At the Circle of these Economies, I think we should focus on working on this idea of value. This is very important. I don't think we'll be able to find a solution unless we have a method based on action. We've always been very concerned that we talk a lot about the subjects of the cross, and about what, and we don't know about how. We've written a book about this idea of how. There are three models. Is positive business map. The first thing is that find out how. You have to have a model, governance model. How do we carry out governance of businesses? The reasons to be together, systematic work on the stakeholders and the ecosystems, and the decision-making systems to be able to work with these people. The second point is to deliberately look at our business models. We were saying earlier, to scale up, we have to have CSR at the heart of the business strategy and businesses. We have to reinvent these business models. This is what I was saying about value. In this respect, I recommend you look at companies like CTO or the Compagnie Nationale du Rhône to see at how they are capable of looking at things in terms of an ecosystem without losing their role as an energy supplier. It's necessary to rethink the energy models, the value models. The other thing is the culture of leaders and the culture of employees. For Renault, we're working on training 180 employees to become aware of environmental issues and to enable them to switch over so that this has an impact on the business strategies, that they're capable of changing their business model. By changing to action, you rethink business governance, you deliberately change the business models, and you transform the cultural models. At IKEA, we are optimists by nature, and if we rethink values together and every company has its own method for action, we're able to succeed. You know that people say optimism is determination and pessimism is reason. There's some interesting examples you've given, which where we can see that examples of transformation and scaling up. We can see that CSR can completely change a company, including the employees. You were talking about training, which is an important aspect. A lot of companies today are training their employees in CSR. So there's a collective thing at stake here. You're not talking about a cherry on the cake and the compliance with standards and rather dusty concepts, which is really something that's completely transformative at every level of the company. This is an interesting message. Just one more thing. Human nature is not destructive. If you look at human nature and you can get humans to be capable of, be aware of the issues, then you can get them to transform themselves. We now move on to the MEDEB. We're moving over to the other side of the Mediterranean. It's also very valuable to hear you. There have been a lot of questions already on the website about this international dimension. How can we act in France and in Europe? Europe wants to be a pioneer in decarbonization, but we forget that we have relations with the South, which are very important, and there will also be effects. We're in the same overall economic system, so there will inevitably be impacts. We're interested to see how you approach this question. You're promoting the change in business models and cultural models. Let me repeat what Arnaud Conglove said just now. You emphasize the cultural aspect of CSR. Yes, thank you. I'm very pleased to be with you today and to contribute a certain enlightenment and from the South in these forums where everything is very French and very European, but the international dimension, it seems to me, is not fully present. So I'd like to bring the point of view from the South and the experience of Tunisia, where I live and work. CSR, over the last few years, is being seen as a way of providing a solution or several solutions to global problems. I think the recent crises, whether it's COVID-19 or the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, have generated global problems and have made clear the need to find global solutions to these global problems. CSR, from that point of view, can be seen as a way of getting companies to behave in a more virtuous way and a more responsible way. However, on that basis, this means we're talking about a transformation of cultural behavior of companies. Cultural transformation cannot be imposed and cannot be carried out in the short term. It's a long-term task, and it requires the deployment of several concomitant types of action. It cannot be imposed. It's not because you have a law that says all companies have to adhere to CSR, as was been the case in Tunisia in 2018. For example, in June 2018, the Tunisian government ratified a law on CSR. 5 years later, this text has not been implemented because the decrees to implement the law have never been put in place and probably never will be. This text corresponded to, at a particular time, to a political desire to give a strong signal to areas of activity where the local population no longer accepted the irresponsible behaviors of certain companies in extractive industries, whether it's phosphates or hydrocarbons, and saying to them, nothing has been done correctly so far. You'll see with this law, everything will be much better from now on. But in fact, this law represents, highlights a double risk that threatens CSR. The first risk is an administrative risk. In other words, people use CSR in the administrative and political sphere, and they don't sufficiently integrate companies and economic stakeholders in the appropriation of the CSR. Nothing will be done in that case. The second risk is that we want to force companies to integrate additional costs associated with CSR that they are not ready to assume, and so nothing happens then either. I was saying that CSR is a cultural transformation, requires a cultural transformation. For me, there are 5 aspects to this. First aspect is education. It's true that it's urgent to carry this cultural transformation today, but if we don't take account of the methods for deploying this cultural transformation, it'll just be wishful thinking. So the first aspect is education. From the youngest age, children have to understand the behavioral aspects and as responsible adults in a company. The second aspect is information. The third aspect is incentives. We have to be exemplary There has to be a leadership in the company which is exemplary and shows the way. The fourth aspect is correction. A fifth aspect is positive sanctions and negative sanctions afterwards. Positive sanctions means that we positively reward companies that are taking the right path. I'd like to end by taking an example in Tunisia of what we could have done if we had adopted a true CSR approach over the last few years. We're talking about a major economic crisis in Tunisia, and this is the case. We often talk about the failure of two sectors, phosphates and hydrocarbons. For example, in phosphates, we produced 8 million tons in 2010. We're moving to 115 million tons today. We're producing 3 million tons because populations are not ready to integrate this production. They're doing everything they can to stop this production. The second sector is hydrocarbons. We're producing 100,000 barrels a day. Today, we're producing 35,000 barrels per day. Again, there's a lot of protest by the local people. If the approach had been true CSR, with a sense of responsibility, where the negotiations would have taken place in transparency, with credibility, and this would have led to appropriation of the solutions by the local communities and active and economic players, it would have worked. I'd like to end by saying the CSR is faced by global problems. The South has been mentioned earlier. It is faced with global problems, and we need to have global solutions to solve these global problems, and this requires global solidarity, which today is not sufficiently present. Thank you very much.
Merci, on voit bien, on vous
Thank you very much. By listening to you, all of you, we realize how it is a systemic topic. It's not on one side companies and on the other side culture, society, and information. This is a topic that I'd like to react to, but if there are questions in the room, please raise your hand and prepare your question. And in the meantime, I will read a question that was sent online. Several questions are on standards. Each of us understands very well that standards are a factor of acceleration because at some point it encourages the industrials to invest in a particular technology. And at the same time, several people who follow us tell us, are the standards, isn't there a risk for French companies if, for example, we have very strict rules to develop electrical vehicle? Don't we open the door to the Chinese cars, for example? This is the type of dilemma that you brought up earlier on, Thierry. We think a lot about dilemmas. It creates a lot of dilemmas. So this question of standards is very important. It's a bit confused. Some people are asking in terms of financial markets or European rules. Is it an accelerator or doesn't it put our companies at risk? Which one of you would like to answer this question on standards? Axel? No, I'm not going to answer directly on standards. I have a triple conviction on transformation, and I don't think that standards are the right answer. I don't believe in the fact that our Western societies are declining. I don't think we're ready to give up the standards of living that we have. It is true in Europe. It is even more true in the US. We are used to a level of living standards that we don't want to give up. And the southern countries, it's a different story. Some African states, an African statesman said that the population was growing and that the production of the milk was reducing. So how can we help people who are in underserved neighborhoods? So standards are a good thing, but if there's no concrete solution, we're going to create revolution. Second thing is I believe that the market economy and what works the best in the market economy is how we regulate this transition with price. This is a very political topic. And third, it's investment. How do we develop investment policies that are massive enough with a high level of risk to encourage those transitions? I would like to shed a light on standards. Standards are necessary, but unfortunately, they're not enough. The reality is we need standards, but we know that every collective system, we need to regulate and apply standards. If your idea is to be systemic, it has to be ecosystemic, because the value of tomorrow is not measured with the result of each company. That's why we work on the development of networks if we want to get somewhere. In every ecosystem, we know it well, the dilemma of the prisoner is here to remind us of it. It's a cooperation. Cooperation is not based on standards. Cooperation is based on cooperation agreements and new forms of contracts. So we need to use standards for what it's worth, which is to set a number of rules of the game and then trust the entrepreneurs who can cooperate, who can work together. We need to give them enough leeway to work together in a dynamic of cooperation. Axel Lemaire, and then we'll take a couple of questions from in the room. I see a few hands raised. We'll take 3 questions at the same time. I say that for the person who's holding out the mic. This question of standards is fundamental. In the US, we see a lot of companies that are rebelling against what they live as constraints, environmental and social constraints imposed by their investors, who nowadays are asking them to show the positive impact that they have in these fields, and they rebel against it by saying we're here to make profits and that's it. At the same time that some European companies can say, yes, but it is quite unfair because when we're in China, for example, our competitors are not bound to the same regulations and standards. So I'm just going to express my personal opinion, but I am glad to see that we're not using this argument where we're trying to put an end to child labor, for example. I keep believing in a form of universal rules, and Europe is the most advanced continent in the definition of those types of rules, with the taxonomy, the European taxonomy. And I think it is a conflict or the expression of European values within those standards. I give you a very concrete example. An international company has a problem with rules in terms of disabled people, because in France, they are obliged to show that they conduct some actions to integrate some people who are in a situation of disablement, versus in the US, they have to be careful not to point out disabled people. So for the people who are from ethnic background, it is different. In France, we should not take account of these people, versus in the US, we need to count the number of people from different ethnic backgrounds in their employees to make sure that they achieve their goals of diversity. The GDPR, to protect the private data and public freedoms. When I talk about this, people told me, "Oh, no more standards, more standards." So this is a tool of soft law to protect personal data. 3 questions in the room. Thank you. Please, hello. I'm going to try to be quick. Mr. Martel, you asked the question about your legitimacy between the milk of the cows or the children. The CNRS has created its own deontology committee for companies to know how to ask ourselves the right question from a scientific point of view. Another question. We're going to take 3 questions. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for this intervention. I'd like to add something to the previous questions, and I'm even going to bring an answer to it. The people who are wondering about their legitimacy to make a choice, I believe that there are a lot of citizens' movements and consumers' movement that go up to companies that embody these commitments, and that can be done particularly on the choice of insurance. The question I wanted to ask, because there's several of you that have brought up this topic of changing of scale and getting into action, I'd like to go back on the territorial dimension and local dimension. How can we do when we're a very small company and when we're not subject to these standards to have commitments with actors on our territory? What kinds of solution do you imagine for those small companies? Another question? And then we'll listen to the lady behind. So you, as an introduction, you identified CSR, and the definition that you chose is the definition of societal and environmental responsibility. In societal, the 16th commitment of the SDGs, which is to promote a peaceful society. When I say a peaceful society, if you look at the current context, which is not really peaceful. So how companies today contribute to promote the state that cannot do everything on its own, how the public sector can help when we're in a context of CSR. That's a lot of responsibility. I have a question for Mr. Martel. We talk about CSR. CSR is the contribution to the 3 pillars of sustainable development. There's an economic pillar as well, so the company has to remain economically sustainable. As an insurer, I wanted to ask you the question, how do you position yourself with the climate change, the number of risks that are growing and the number of damage? How could you going to keep paying reparation to your clients from disaster linked to climate change? And how do you manage your CSR approach to protect your clients from all those disasters? Monsieur Martel will start. Thierry Martel will start. I'm going to answer on the ethics committee. It exists, and this is a risk for democracy. You see that Zuckerberg has his own ethics committee, and he decides who speaks and who doesn't speak, what's going on or what's not going on, and he decides to cut the account of a political person. I think it's the democracy that is in danger. And to ask companies to have ethics committee because the state is not fully playing its part is a whole topic in itself. And I believe if companies go too far on the field of democracy, it's the foundation of our democracy that are at risk. On the question of climate risk, you are right to mention it. I'm going to give you an idea. In France, we talk a lot about 3 million houses that are being threatened by damage. To do the prevention for a house is 15K. That represents 45 billion. We don't get 45 billion. So we're facing some huge financing issues, major financing requests, demands. Maybe, Axel, you want to say something on the territorial dimension? I would like to go back on standards to say that for a century and a half, the Western world or the Northern Hemisphere polluted happily and immensely. For the last 30 years, we tell the South, it's a global problem, we have to pollute each other. I understand and I fully adhere to this approach, but it's difficult to admit it. And that sends us back to the global governance of the world that challenges the international institutions and their functioning. And it is not because there are going to be some large gatherings in Paris or elsewhere that are going to change the way things go. We need cooperation, but we need cooperation that is not only territorial. We need trans-border cooperation and decentralized cooperation, because the issues that are dealt by CSR ignore the limits, the boundaries, and if we don't have global solidarity, we won't go very far. Axel Lemaire, you have the last word to conclude. I so agree with what you just said. in reality, the real problem is, aren't there too many standards for European companies, but how can we together address the real challenges that are global, and will manage to help developing countries to one day being able to, as well, being capable to respect those standards. It's like, taxes. I would like for everyone to be paying too much taxes one day. This is a joke. So, on the local dimension, I believe that it is probably the best one for action. And I said when I was a member of a national movement, the state is here to give a framework, but action starts on the ground. And I worked for the biggest association in France. And the association knew how to loan money with the pro bono factors and donors systems in the company. So maybe the very small company to turn to those funding processes. But what is still difficult in the triptych association, public powers and companies is to develop projects together, is to create solutions together to address challenges that are very concrete. And concretely, it implies finding some time and to be able to hand an assignment to a team member to tell him that as part of his time, he's going to be working on that for the full-time employees. So full-time employees would be working on those solutions, and not just to mitigate the risks and the adverse impact of climate change, for example. That's where we go from CSR to the SDGs. Marie-Françoise, to wrap up, I would like to say that CSR is a reality in science, is a reality in the conscience. So it's a utopia that we need to follow up on and to keep pursuing. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you.